The thick mist of the redwoods swallowed their car as Rachel, Mia, and Chris drove deeper into the forest, excitement buzzing in the air despite the heavy clouds hanging overhead. The long road trip had been filled with laughter and music, but now, as they arrived at the secluded campsite, a quiet unease settled over them. The towering trees seemed to close in around them, their gnarled branches swaying like skeletal hands in the cold wind. Even the steady drizzle that began to fall felt ominous, like the forest itself was holding its breath. "This is perfect," Chris said, his voice trying to mask the tension in the air. He had always been the brave one, eager for the thrill of adventure. Mia, on the other hand, was already pulling her jacket tighter against the chill. Rachel kept her eyes on the trees, the air thick with the scent of wet pine. Something about the silence felt wrong. The campsite was empty save for the echo of their own footsteps as they set up their tents on a dry patch of ground. The rain wasn't heavy yet, but the forest stillness made everything feel more oppressive. Once the tents were up, they huddled around a small fire they managed to ignite despite the wet wood. The flames crackled, casting eerie shadows on their faces, their flickering light barely making a dent in the dark expanse of the forest. As they ate, the usual sounds of the forest, the rustle of leaves, the chirping of birds, were eerily absent. It felt like the wilderness itself was watching, listening. The steady patter of rain against the tents seemed to grow louder with every passing minute. Chris tried to lighten the mood by joking about the strange local legends of hikers disappearing without a trace in these very woods. But Rachel couldn't shake the feeling that the stories weren't just tales to scare the locals. "It's just the rain," she said, but even as the words left her mouth, she felt a strange knot twist in her stomach. The air felt thick with something unspoken, a weight pressing down on her chest. Her laughter was forced as she dismissed her own unease. By the time they turned in for the night, the rain had picked up, a steady drumbeat on the fabric of their tents. But it wasn't just the rain that unsettled Rachel. It was the silence that had settled around them. The deeper they went into the woods, the more Rachel wondered if they had made a mistake coming here. If something, someone, was waiting just out of sight. The last thing she heard before sleep claimed her was the wind howling through the trees, its mournful cry a reminder that they were truly alone, miles from civilization. But she couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. The night dragged on in an uncomfortable silence, broken only by the relentless tapping of rain against their tents. Rachel's eyes fluttered open, her sleep disrupted by a soft, rhythmic sound that seemed to be coming from outside. She blinked at the darkness, trying to push away the feeling that something was wrong. She checked her watch, just past midnight. Her heart thudded in her chest as the sound outside grew clearer. Shuffling footsteps, moving around their campsite. For a moment, she convinced herself it was Chris, stumbling back from a late-night bathroom trip. But as the shuffling grew louder, Rachel realized it was coming from the other side of her tent. It was too close. It wasn't Chris. There was something off about it. The footsteps circled the camp, slow and deliberate, like whoever was out there was measuring the space, as though they were waiting for something. Rachel's breath caught in her throat, her mind racing. She didn't know if it was the cold or the fear that made her shiver, but the hair on the back of her neck stood on end. Tentatively, she unzipped the corner of her tent, her pulse hammering in her ears. The rain blurred her vision, but through the wet fabric she could make out faint footprints in the mud, tracing a slow, methodical circle around their camp. One of the leaders grabbed Rachel's ankles and turned her around, the circle tracing a slow, methodical circle around their camp. Her stomach dropped. The uneasy silence stretched on, punctuated only by the sound of the rain, and then the tent jerked, a violent shove. The entire tent shifted, as if someone or something had pressed their hands firmly against it, causing the fabric to ripple and pull inward. Rachel froze, every muscle in her body locking up as her heart pounded in her chest. The force wasn't from the wind or the rain, it was something far worse. The weight of it pressed down on her, making it hard to breathe. "Mia?" "Chris?" she whispered, her voice trembling as she felt the panic rising in her throat. No response came, just the eerie silence of the forest and the continued drumming of the rain. The pressure against the tent disappeared just as suddenly as it had come. The silence that followed felt suffocating, heavy with dread. Rachel lay perfectly still, her hands clutching the edges of her sleeping bag, willing herself not to move, not to make a sound. Her mind raced. Was someone out there? What was it? She strained her ears, listening for any sign of movement, but there was nothing. The air was thick with tension, every small noise amplified in the stillness. After what felt like an eternity, Rachel gathered the strength to peek outside again, her eyes squinting through the rain. She could just make out the muddy footprints from before, still faint, but clear enough to show they had been circling the tents all night. But there was no sign of anyone now. Her heart thudded wildly in her chest as she realized the terrifying truth. Someone, or something, had been watching them all along. The first light of dawn filtered weakly through the rain-soaked trees, casting long, eerie shadows across the campsite. The rain had slowed to a drizzle, but the air still felt heavy, saturated with something unspoken. Rachel rubbed her eyes, exhausted but unable to shake the feeling of dread that clung to her skin. She'd barely slept, and now she couldn't get the image of the tent shaking, the eerie sound of footsteps circling out of her head. All around the mills, Mia and Chris emerged from their tents slowly, their movements stiff, their eyes red-rimmed. They must have heard something too, Rachel thought. They were different now, as if the night had drained the color from their faces. Chris broke the silence first, his voice low and hesitant. "Did anyone hear something last night?" His words hung in the air, charged with an unspoken question, an invitation for them to share in the horror they had all experienced in the dark. Mia exchanged a nervous glance with Rachel before speaking. I heard whispering. It wasn't just the wind." Her voice trembled, as if even speaking the words aloud might make the memory more real. "It sounded like someone was right outside my tent, just talking, low, like they were trying to keep quiet." Rachel felt a chill run down her spine. She had assumed it was just the storm playing tricks on her, but now she wasn't so sure. Chris didn't say anything for a moment, then finally spoke, his voice barely audible. "I thought I saw something move, a shadow, but when I looked, nothing was there." He shook his head, as if trying to shake off the memory of it. Rachel's stomach churned as she tried to process what they were all saying. They'd all heard something, seen something. It wasn't just the storm. Something, or someone, had been out there with them in the night. The moment of shared fear was shattered when Chris pointed toward Rachel's tent, his face pale. "What the hell is that?" Rachel turned, her breath catching in her throat. Her tent, a normally sturdy, weatherproof shelter, had been slashed open, a clean cut running diagonally from top to bottom. The fabric hung loosely in the rain, the gash too precise to be the work of an animal. Chris's voice shook as he muttered, "It's not an animal, that's deliberate." Rachel's hands trembled as she reached out to touch the edge of the tear. The sharp edges of the fabric felt wrong, almost too sharp, as though the cut had been made by something unnatural. Nothing had been stolen from the tent, nothing disturbed, but the sight of the rip left them all on edge, a reminder that whatever had been outside was still very much a threat. The trio stood in stunned silence for a moment, the rain pattering gently against the earth beneath their feet, as if mocking their unease. A shiver ran down Rachel's spine as she looked around the camp, the sense of being watched still lingering in the thick air. The trees towered above them, silent and immovable, as if the forest itself had conspired to keep them trapped here. Finally, Chris broke the silence. "You need to get out of here, now!" Without another word, they gathered their belongings, hastily packing up the gear they had just spent hours setting up. The weight of the unspoken fear between them hung like a fog. None of them spoke as they worked, each person lost in their own thoughts, their eyes darting nervously around the campsite, as if expecting something to emerge from the trees. The sense of urgency pushed them forward, and soon they were packed and ready to leave. But as they stood there, staring at the now silent forest around them, Rachel felt an overwhelming sense of finality. The woods had felt alive last night, a presence watching them, waiting for them to make a mistake. And now that they were leaving, it felt as if something was letting them go. But only just. It wasn't over. Although senses of control had failed Miles's, but now that they not yet, the drive away from the redwoods felt like an escape, but the tightness in Rachel's chest never eased. As they sped down the winding road, the rain followed them, slashing against the car's windows, as if the storm itself was reluctant to let them go. The wipers swished rhythmically, but the sound only added to the oppressive silence that filled the car. None of them spoke. The air was thick with the weight of what had happened, the terrifying realization that something had been out there, watching them. Mia sat in the back seat, her face pale and her eyes wide. She stared out the window as if expecting to see something lurking in the mist that rolled across the road. What if someone was watching us the whole time, she whispered, breaking the silence with a question that none of them wanted to answer. Rachel's heart thudded in her chest, and she could feel the unease creeping back up her spine. She thought about the muddy footprints, the whispering voices, the tent jerking in the night, the clean cut through the fabric of her tent. Every detail seemed to lead to one horrifying conclusion. They had been stalked. Someone, or something, had been following them, playing with them, toying with their fear. Suddenly, the thought gnawed at her, as if some invisible presence was still with them, even as they sped away from the woods. It wasn't over. She knew it in her gut. Chris, who had been driving with a clenched jaw, suddenly let out a shaky laugh, though it was hollow, unnatural. "Maybe we're just overreacting," he said, his voice a little too high. "It's probably just some crazy person who wanted to scare us." Nothing more, but Rachel didn't believe him. No, this wasn't a prank. This felt real, and as much as she wished it were just her imagination, she knew deep down that it wasn't. As they continued down the winding highway, Rachel's mind raced. She tried to focus on the road ahead, to push away the images of those muddy footprints circling their tents, the shadow in the trees, but it was impossible. Each turn in the road felt like it could bring them back to the campsite, back to whatever had been waiting for them in the woods. The radio crackled to life, and the voice of a news anchor broke through the tension. Rachel's eyes flicked to the radio, her heart skipping a beat when she heard the words, "In a remote part of the redwoods, local authorities have been investigating a string of mysterious disappearances in the area. Witnesses have reported strange sightings, and several campers have gone missing under unexplained circumstances in the past few years." Rachel's breath caught in her throat. The words felt like a punch to the gut, each one confirming the worst of her fears. It was as if the universe had conspired to validate everything they had just experienced. They weren't the first to feel the darkness of the redwoods, and they wouldn't be the last. Mia's voice trembled from the back seat. "Do you think we were next?" None of them answered. There was no need to. The truth hung in the air like a thick fog, suffocating them. They had narrowly escaped, but the fear lingered, pressing in on them from all sides. The redwoods would never let them forget what they had experienced. The rain continued to beat down on the car as they drove further away, but the feeling of being hunted, of being watched, never left them. And as the fog rolled in, Rachel couldn't shake the nagging thought that someone had been waiting for them to leave, waiting for the right moment to make its presence known. And though they were driving away, she couldn't help but feel that the redwoods hadn't finished with them just yet. Lucas and Amber had always loved camping. For them, it was an escape, a way to reconnect with each other and with nature. By the time they arrived, the rain had already started, a light drizzle that quickly grew heavier. The mist clung to the treetops, swallowing the landscape in layers of gray. Their chosen campsite sat on a high ridge overlooking a canyon, with the sound of a rushing river far below filling the air. It was beautiful, but the isolation was palpable. The nearest campsite was a mile away, and even that felt too far should anything go wrong. They worked quickly, setting up the tent before the rain could soak their gear. Amber kept glancing toward the edge of the woods, where the trees stood like dark sentinels, their gnarled branches reaching skyward. She felt a chill that had nothing to do with the winter storm. "It's just the weather," she muttered to herself, trying to banish her unease. As night fell, the rain intensified, pounding against the tent and turning the ground to mud. The cold seeped through their jackets, and Lucas struggled to light a fire with the damp wood they'd brought. Each failed attempt sent sparks flying into the wet air, and Amber couldn't help but notice how the sparks vanished almost immediately, as if the storm itself were swallowing them. Finally, Lucas managed to coax the fire to life. The small flames flickered weakly, their light barely pushing back the encroaching darkness. They sat close together, their hands outstretched toward the fragile warmth. The storm raged on, the wind howling through the canyon like a distant, mournful wail. Ember shivered and glanced toward the woods again. For a moment she thought she saw a movement, just a flicker, a shadow slipping between the trees. The storm crashed against the house again. For a moment she thought she saw a movement, just a flicker, a shadow slipping between the trees. She blinked, and it was gone. She hesitated before speaking, her voice barely audible above the rain. "Lucas? Do you ever get the feeling that someone's watching you?" Lucas looked up from the fire, his face lit by its orange glow. He chuckled softly, but there was a nervous edge to it. "Come on, Amber. It's just us out here. Who's going to be watching us in the middle of a storm?" Amber forced a smile, but the uneasy feeling lingered. The fire crackled weakly, and the night pressed in around them, heavy and impenetrable. As they crawled into their sleeping bags, the sound of the rushing river and the relentless rain filled their ears. Ember closed her eyes, but her mind refused to quiet. She couldn't shake the sensation of unseen eyes, watching from the shadows. The fire sputtered weakly, casting flickering shadows on the tent walls. Inside, Lucas and Amber lay in silence, the steady drumming of rain and the occasional gust of wind their only companions. Amber's mind refused to rest, replaying the shadow she thought she had seen earlier. She told herself it was just her imagination, but the unease gnawed at her. Then a new sound broke through the storm, a faint, rhythmic knocking. At first, Amber thought it might be the wind rattling a tree branch against something, but the sound was too deliberate. Tap, 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 tap. It came from somewhere beyond the firelight, deep in the woods. "Lucas," Amber whispered, her voice barely audible. He stirred and sat up, rubbing his eyes. "What is it? Listen." They both froze, straining to hear over the rain. There it was again, knocking, faint but deliberate. It sent a chill through Ember. "It's probably just a branch," Lucas said, though his tone lacked conviction. He reached for the flashlight. The knocking grew louder, its rhythm unnervingly steady, as if someone, or something, was rapping on an invisible door in the forest. Ember gripped Lucas's arm. "Don't go out there," she said, her voice trembling. "We can't just sit here," Lucas replied, forcing a brave tone. He unzipped the tent slowly, the sound sharp against the backdrop of rain and wind. The cold air hit them immediately, carrying with it the earthy scent of wet leaves and mud. Lucas aimed the flashlight into the darkness. The beam cut through the rain, illuminating the glistening trees and the slick ground, but nothing else. "Hello?" he called, his voice firm despite the unease tightening in his chest. "Is someone out there?" At first there was no response, only the persistent knock, knock, knock. Then, just as suddenly, the sound stopped. "See? Nothing," Lucas said, though his voice betrayed his nerves. He moved the flashlight in a slow arc, scanning the edge of the woods. That's when they saw it. About 20 feet away stood a figure, drenched and motionless. It appeared to be a man, but the rain and shadows made it hard to tell for sure. He or it was unnaturally still, head slightly tilted as if observing them. Lucas swallowed hard. "Hey, you okay?" he called out. The figure didn't respond. It didn't even flinch. Lucas felt Amber's hand tighten on his arm as the seconds dragged on in silence. Then the figure tilted its head further, the motion jerky and unnatural, like a puppet on strings. Without warning, it turned and vanished into the trees, moving so quickly it was almost as if it had been pulled away. Amber gasped. "What? What was that?" "I don't know," Lucas replied, his voice barely above a whisper. He shone the flashlight toward the spot where the figure had stood, but there was nothing there. No footprints, no sign of movement, just the rain-soaked ground and the oppressive darkness of the forest. They retreated into the tent, zipping it up tightly. The fire sputtered out completely, leaving them in near total darkness. Amber hugged her knees to her chest, her mind racing. It could have been someone lost, Lucas offered, though he didn't sound convinced. "Lost people don't move like that," Amber whispered. The knocking didn't return, but the night felt heavier now, the darkness outside their tent alive with unseen eyes. Sleep was impossible. Lucas and Amber sat in their tent, their flashlight casting long, shaky beams as the storm raged on outside. Every sound, the rustle of leaves, the patter of rain, the occasional gust of wind, felt amplified, as if the forest itself were closing in around them. Amber's breathing was shallow, her arms wrapped tightly around herself. "Lucas," she finally said, her voice barely audible, "I don't think we're alone out here." Lucas didn't respond immediately. His jaw was clenched, his eyes fixed on the tent's entrance as if expecting it to unzip at any moment. Finally, he said, "We need to stay calm. Whatever or whoever that was, they're gone now." Amber wasn't so sure. The image of the drenched figure with its unnaturally jerky movements haunted her. And then there was the way it had vanished. Too quick, too unnatural. A sudden noise broke the tense silence. A slow, dragging sound, like something heavy being pulled across the wet ground. It was close, too close. "Did you hear that?" Amber whispered, her nails digging into Lucas's arm. "Yeah," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. He reached for the flashlight again, his hand trembling. The dragging sound grew louder, circling the tent like a predator stalking its prey. It paused near the back of the tent, then started again, moving deliberately, methodically. Lucas flicked the flashlight on and pointed it toward the source of the sound, but the thin fabric of the tent offered little comfort. That was when he pulled out his lighter case. He tucked it behind the thermosol. Shadows danced wildly as the light moved, and for a brief moment they saw it, a silhouette pressed against the tent wall. It wasn't human-shaped, it was elongated, with unnaturally long limbs and a hunched posture. It was the priest coming around the duplex. Amber stifled a scream, her hand clamped over her mouth. The silhouette shifted, the dragging sound replaced by a low, guttural rasp like wet fabric being wrung out. It moved along the tent wall, its misshapen form casting distorted shadows inside. "Lucas, what is that?" Amber whispered, her voice breaking. "I don't know," he replied, his heart pounding in his chest. He was trying to think rationally, to convince himself it was just a trick of the light, but deep down he knew better. This was something else. The silhouette stopped near the entrance of the tent, and the rasping sound grew louder. Slowly, the zipper began to move, jerking up an inch, then two. "No, no, no," Amber muttered, scooting backward as far as she could. Lucas lunged forward, grabbing the zipper from the inside and pulling it closed. The thing outside let out a sound, a guttural, wet groan that made Lucas's stomach churn. It tugged at the zipper from the outside, a terrifying tug of war between them. "Help me!" Lucas hissed, and Amber scrambled forward, adding her weight to hold the zipper shut. The thing outside didn't seem strong, but its persistence was unnerving. It tugged and pulled, the rasping sound now interspersed with a faint knocking, like the noise they'd heard earlier. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the struggle stopped. The dragging sound returned, receding into the woods until it was swallowed by the rain. Lucas and Amber stayed frozen, gripping the zipper tightly. Minutes passed in silence, and the rain seemed to ease, but neither of them dared move. When they finally let go, Amber burst into quiet sobs, the adrenaline and fear overwhelming her. "We can't stay here," Lucas said, his voice shaking. "First light, we're leaving." Amber nodded, though the thought of making it through the rest of the night filled her with dread. The storm outside was relentless, but it was nothing compared to whatever was lurking in the darkness. The rain continued to pour as dawn approached, but neither Lucas nor Amber had slept. They sat huddled in the tent, their flashlight long dead and their nerves frayed. Every creak of the forest and patter of rain made them flinch. The creature, or whatever it was, hadn't returned, but the memory of its distorted silhouette loomed in their minds. As the first gray light of morning filtered through the storm clouds, Lucas decided it was time to leave. "We have to go now," he said firmly, his voice steadier than he felt. Amber nodded, her face pale and drawn. They packed in silence, their movements quick and jittery. Every second spent outside the tent felt like an eternity. As they loaded their gear into their backpacks, the forest seemed unnaturally quiet, as though the storm had muted everything but their ragged breaths. The rushing river below sounded distant, almost muffled. Amber glanced around nervously, her eyes darting to every shadow, every movement in the trees. "Do you feel that?" she whispered. Lucas frowned. "Feel what?" "The air. It's heavy, like we're being watched." He wanted to dismiss her words, but he couldn't shake the same sensation. It was as if the forest itself had eyes. "Let's just keep moving," he said, gripping her hand tightly. The trail back to their car was slick with mud, and the storm had turned small streams into treacherous torrents. As they descended toward the parking area, Amber stopped abruptly, pulling Lucas to a halt. "Do you hear that?" she asked, her voice trembling. Lucas strained to listen. At first, all he could hear was the rain, but then he caught a thick rhythmic knocking sound. It was distant, but unmistakable, echoing through the canyon like a warning. "Don't stop," he urged, pulling her forward. "We're almost there," but the knocking grew louder, closer, accompanied by a wet, slapping sound that made Lucas's stomach churn. Amber clutched his arm, her eyes wide with fear. "It's following us!" They broke into a run, their boots slipping on the muddy trail. Branches whipped at their faces, and the rain blurred their vision, but they didn't dare slow down. The sounds pursued them, relentless and growing louder. Finally, they reached the parking lot. Their car was the only one there, its windows fogged from the damp. Lucas fumbled for the keys with shaking hands, unlocking the doors and practically shoving Amber inside. He climbed into the driver's seat, slamming the door shut and locking it. The knocking stopped. For a moment, the only sound was their labored breathing and the rain pounding on the car. Lucas turned the key in the ignition, and the engine roared to life. Relief washed over him, but it was short-lived. Amber let out a gasp, pointing toward the tree line. "Lucas!" "Look." He followed her gaze, his heart sinking. There, standing at the edge of the forest, was the drenched figure. Its posture was hunched, its limbs unnaturally long and thin. The rain dripped from its tattered clothes, pooling around its feet. Its face was still obscured, but Lucas could feel its gaze boring into him. "Go!" Amber screamed, and Lucas didn't hesitate. He slammed the car into gear and sped down the gravel road, the tires skidding on the wet surface. As they drove, Amber kept glancing out the back window, her breath hitching with every shadow. "It's gone, right?" she asked, her voice fragile. Lucas didn't answer. He kept his eyes on the road, his knuckles white on the steering wheel, but he couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. They finally reached the main highway, the forest behind them. The rain had lessened to a drizzle, and the sky was beginning to clear. Amber exhaled a shaky breath, leaning back in her seat. "We made it," she whispered. Lucas nodded, though his grip on the wheel didn't loosen. But as they turned a corner, his blood ran cold. There, in the middle of the road, stood the drenched figure. It tilted its head, just as it had before, and then it stepped toward the car. Lucas slammed the brakes, but the figure vanished. Gone, as if it had never been there. The car skidded to a stop, the tires kicking up a spray of water. Amber was trembling, her hand clutching his arm. What was that?" she stammered. Lucas didn't answer. He stared at the empty road ahead, his chest heaving. Without a word, he pressed the accelerator and drove. The image of the drenched figure burned into his mind. They never went camping again. Claire had always sought solace in the rain. It washed away the noise of the world, leaving her with a rare, calming silence. That's why she rented the remote cabin deep in the Oregon woods, a place where the rain fell almost every day. She arrived late in the afternoon, her car bouncing along the rutted dirt road. The cabin stood at the edge of a dense forest, surrounded by towering pines that seemed to close in around her. The first thing she noticed was the isolation. No neighbors, no distant hum of cars, just the sound of raindrops drumming against the roof and the wind whispering through the trees. It was perfect. Or so she thought. Inside, the cabin was quaint but chilly. The fireplace was stacked with logs, and she quickly set to work lighting it. As the flames crackled to life, she unpacked her belongings, setting her favorite book on the coffee table. It was a cozy scene, yet there was an undercurrent of unease. She brushed it off as the adjustment to being alone. By the time darkness fell, the rain had intensified, hammering against the windows in relentless waves. But she barred the windows in relentless waves. Claire wrapped herself in a blanket by the fire, savoring the warmth. But her peace was interrupted by a soft tap, tap, tap on the window behind her. She froze, the book slipping from her hands. The tapping was rhythmic, deliberate, too consistent to be the rain. Slowly she turned to look, but the window was fogged, the glass streaked with rain. She leaned closer, squinting to make out the shapes beyond. Nothing, just the forest. She laughed nervously, shaking her head. "Get a grip, Claire," she muttered. She returned to her book, trying to ignore the prickling sensation on the back of her neck, as if someone were watching her. Her heart beat. Claire jolted awake in the middle of the night. The fire had died down to glowing embers, and the cabin was shrouded in darkness. She couldn't pinpoint what had woken her, perhaps a dream or the restless rain battering the roof. But then she heard it, a faint, rhythmic scraping sound. It was coming from the front porch. Her heart began to race as she sat up, clutching the blanket around her. The sound was deliberate, like someone dragging something sharp along the wooden railing. She reached for her phone, but it was dead. The charger, still in her bag, felt miles away. Summoning her courage, Claire crept toward the window, careful to avoid making noise. She peeked through the curtain, expecting to see an empty porch. Instead, her breath hitched. She peeked through the curtain, expecting to see an empty porch. Instead, her breath hitched. A figure stood in the rain, just beyond the edge of the porch light. They were tall and motionless, their face obscured by shadows. The figure was dripping wet, their outline blurred by the rain, but there was something unnerving about the way they stood. Unnaturally rigid, almost like a statue. "Hello?" Claire called, her voice trembling. "It's been so long." The figure tilted its head slightly, as if acknowledging her presence. But they didn't move closer. Claire's stomach churned. She wasn't sure if it was fear or the eerie wrongness of the situation. "Do you need help?" she asked, louder this time. No response. Before she could muster the courage to step outside, the figure took a single step back, fading further into the rain. Claire squinted, trying to follow their movements, but they disappeared into the darkness as if they had never been there. The scraping noise resumed, this time louder and coming from the back of the cabin. Claire spun around, her pulse hammering in her ears. She grabbed the nearest object, a fireplace poker, and edged toward the back door. The noise stopped the moment she reached the doorframe. She stood there, the poker shaking in her hand, straining to hear anything over the storm. Bang! The sound of something heavy slamming against the side of the cabin made her jump. Claire let out a small scream, retreating a few steps. The noise came again, this time from the opposite side. It wasn't random, it was purposeful, methodical. She clutched the poker tighter, backing toward the center of the cabin. The shadows seemed to grow darker, the rain louder, as though the entire world was closing in. And then she saw them again. Those eyes. Through the window near the fireplace, two glinting, pale eyes stared at her, unblinking. They were impossibly wide, filled with an unnatural glow that sent shivers racing down her spine. Claire's breath caught in her throat as the figure moved closer to the glass. Before she could react, the eyes disappeared, leaving only the faint imprint of a hand smeared against the window. Claire's trembling fingers dialed for help on the cabin's landline, but the line crackled with static before cutting off entirely. The realization hit her. She was completely alone. Panic surged through her as the silence returned, broken only by the rhythmic drumming of rain on the roof. Gripping the fireplace poker like a lifeline, she moved to secure the cabin. She locked every door and window she could find, shoving furniture in front of the most vulnerable entry points. But as she slid a heavy cabinet in front of the back door, she heard it. A deliberate knock at the front. Her breath caught. It wasn't frantic or aggressive. It was slow, measured, and hauntingly polite. "Who's there?" Claire called out, her voice cracking. No answer. The knock came again, louder this time. Claire backed away, her eyes fixed on the door. Through the peephole, she could see nothing but darkness, as if the rain itself had swallowed the figure. The knocking stopped, replaced by a low scraping noise moving along the side of the cabin. It was as if something sharp was being dragged across the wood, circling her. Claire's mind raced with images of what could be out there. An animal? A person? Neither option felt comforting. Then came the sound of breaking glass. Claire spun around, heart pounding. The small window in the kitchen had been shattered, the jagged shards glinting like teeth in the firelight. She rushed to the room, her footsteps hesitant, the poker raised in her hand. A trail of wet footprints led from the window to the center of the room, where they stopped abruptly. The silence was suffocating, but then she heard it. A single drop of water hitting the floor behind her. Claire turned slowly, every muscle in her body tense. There, standing in the shadowed corner, was the figure. Rainwater pooled beneath them, their drenched clothes clinging to a gaunt frame. The glow of their wide, unblinking eyes pierced the dim room. "Why are you here?" Claire managed to choke out, the words barely audible over the pounding of her heart. The figure tilted its head again, the motion too sharp and unnatural, like a marionette jerked by invisible strings. Slowly they raised one hand, pale and spindly, pointing directly at her. Claire took a step back, her heel catching on the edge of the rug. The figure moved then, not walking but gliding toward her, its feet seemingly never touching the ground. She swung the poker wildly, but it passed through empty air as the figure vanished before her eyes. Her relief was short-lived. A guttural whisper echoed through the cabin, coming from every direction at once. "You shouldn't have come!" Claire screamed, stumbling toward the door. She threw it open, desperate to escape, but the storm outside seemed to have intensified. The rain was a torrential wall, and the path leading away from the cabin was now a river of mud. As she hesitated, something slammed against the doorframe above her, narrowly missing her head. She looked up to see a claw-like hand retracting into the shadows of the porch roof. Claire ran. She didn't care where she was going, only that she had to get away. The storm soaked her to the bone as she stumbled through the trees, the rain blinding her. She could feel the figure's presence, always just behind her, the glow of its eyes cutting through the darkness whenever she dared to look back. Her foot caught on a root, sending her sprawling into the mud. Before she could get up, she felt its cold, skeletal fingers wrapping around her ankle, pulling her back toward the forest. Claire's body went numb with terror as she was dragged backwards, her face scraping against the wet earth. Her breath hitched in ragged gasps, and she clawed desperately at the ground, trying to dig her fingers into the soil to stop herself from being pulled further into the woods. The rain hammered down on her with violent force, mixing with the mud that clung to her skin and clothes. She could hear it now, the soft, rasping breathing of the figure just behind her, each exhale cold against her neck. The chilling whispering returned, wrapping around her like an invisible noose. "You're so close. Just a little further," Claire screamed. But her voice was swallowed by the storm. She managed to roll over onto her back, her legs kicking furiously as she tried to break free from its grip. The figure was kneeling in front of her now, its eyes gleaming like twin orbs of malevolent light. Its face was obscured by shadow, but its features were wrong, twisted, distorted, as if reality itself was bending around its form. The unnaturalness of its movement, the way it seemed to float rather than walk, made Claire's stomach churn with dread. In a final, desperate act, Claire swung the fireplace poker wildly, the metal connecting with something soft. She felt a sickening wet thud, like hitting damp flesh, and the figure recoiled with an inhuman hiss. For a moment, everything was still. Then the figure let out a low, guttural growl, its eyes narrowing as if it was displeased by her resistance. The hand that had been gripping her ankle snapped out of the shadows, and with an unnatural jerk, it seized her wrist. Claire gasped, her fingers numbing as the cold, bony fingers dug into her skin, tightening with painful force. "You're mine!" the figure hissed, its voice a venomous whisper that seemed to vibrate through her skull. The rain was deafening now, but Claire could still hear the unmistakable sound of footsteps approaching from the woods. More figures? Was she already too late to escape? With one last surge of adrenaline, Claire twisted her body, snapping the poker toward the figure's face. It screamed, a terrible, inhuman sound, as the metal made contact with its face, splintering the darkness around it. The glow of its eyes flickered like dying flames before the figure crumpled to the ground, its body convulsing violently. Claire didn't stop. She scrambled to her feet and ran as fast as her legs could carry her through the storm, ignoring the pain, the fatigue, the fear gnawing at her gut. The box was heavily armored. It had 6 locks, and both of them were loaded. From the darkness, glowing eyes appeared. Countless eyes, blinking in the blackness, watching, waiting. Claire realized in that final moment of terror that she was not alone. The figures weren't gone. They had only been waiting for her to find them. Her screams were drowned by the storm, and then there was nothing.